Welcome to Darkwatch Stories, where we bring to life the chills, the shadows, and the mysteries that linger in the dark. If you enjoy spine-tingling stories and want to support the journey into the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now, sit back, dim the lights, and let's step into tonight's story. Summer 1991. On the desolate beach of Daggerland, two 8-year-old boys, George Lost and David Winters, ran barefoot across the sand, their pockets bulging with stones collected all week. Lake Erie glowed pink in the fading light, unnervingly calm. George was sturdy, broad-shouldered, dark hair falling over his eyes. David was taller, leaner, blonde hair always wild, and far more eager to test the world than watch it. They raced down from the bluff, breath mixing with the damp wind. David usually won, but today, just as he turned to tease George, his voice died mid-laugh. "George," he whispered, low and strange. George followed his gaze. Something dark lay at the waterline. At first glance, it seemed like a large fish washed ashore, but as they approached, their footsteps slowed. The fish's body stretched almost half of George's height, belly torn wide, white ribs exposed in the dying light. No organs remained, as if someone had scooped them out. The stench was heavier than any dead fish they'd ever seen. David crouched, face pale. Across its silver scales were long, parallel gouges, deep, clean, almost like claw marks. Not teeth, not a propeller, not a knife. "What did that?" David murmured. George swallowed hard, probably a bigger fish. But he knew he was lying. Cold waves slapped their ankles, like something breathing beneath the surface. George kicked sand over the mangled belly, trying to chase away the chill crawling up his spine. "Let's go. It's getting dark." But David lingered, eyes locked on the gouges as if they were a warning. Years later, they wouldn't remember the fish. They would remember the feeling Lake Erie watching them. Decades passed. David Winters became the county's lake patrolman. By day, he checked buoys, towed stalled boats, and chased reckless kids from dangerous waters. By night, he handled what no one wanted to admit existed. Daggerland only had a handful of working boats left. The only truly reliable one was David's Boston whaler Guardian. His sailboat, Claire, rested at the dock, like a memory too stubborn to release. Ever since Samantha disappeared, Daggerland hadn't been the same. Her footprints stopped cleanly at the bluff's edge, no slip, no struggle. 2 days later, Josh Maddox vanished and returned hollow-eyed, unable to speak of what he'd seen. Then the Harper family's SUV died on Lake Road. The parents vanished into the dark, and only their children survived, thanks to Marcus Wilkins. Those tragedies birthed new unwritten laws. No children near the water. No walking the shoreline alone. Avoid the cliffs after dark. Report anything strange to the sheriff. George Lost once, the sturdy boy on the beach, was now sheriff, and his rules hung over the town like a curfew bell. But rules restrained people, not whatever lived beneath the lake. That morning, David began his patrol as always. He loosened the ropes, let the whaler drift free, engines coughing once before humming steady. A buoy was off position. Another needed repainting. He towed an old fisherman back to the pier, enduring the man's grumbling. Everything felt normal, but normal now only meant nothing awful yet. By noon, David docked the whaler and drove inland to his home. He preferred living far from the shoreline where the air smelled of grass instead of algae. But the moment he stepped out of his truck, the screen door banged open. Owen, his son, darted outside, glove on hand, Crichton the German shepherd close behind. "Dad, catch!" Owen beamed, lifting a baseball like a trophy. David smiled, tired but fond. "Give me 5 minutes," Owen countered immediately. "Sheriff George says procrastination is the enemy of discipline." David laughed and shook his head. They began tossing easy pitches. Owen's arm was wild but enthusiastic. Every missed catch sent Crichton lunging as if it were his turn. Owen babbled as they played, reciting police radio codes George had taught him. "Did you know 10 to 7 means out of service?" David caught the ball. "You calling me out of service?" Owen grinned. When his throws weakened and breath grew short, David called for a break. "Wash up. Lunch soon." For a fleeting moment, life felt ordinary, a luxury lately. Later that day, George walked Main Street. Shops that once stayed open until dusk now closed early, blinds drawn tight. People hurried home, avoiding the sheriff's eyes, as if darkness arrived faster each day. George sat in his cruiser and called his wife, Laura, staying inland with her mother. "Everything okay there?" he asked. Laura said life inland still felt normal, markets full, chatter lively. But her voice dipped when she mentioned seeing children at the grocery store stirring an ache she carried quietly. George looked at the dim houses lining Main Street. "Feels empty here," he admitted. Neither said what they feared. Emptiness meant something else was drawing near. Night fell as David returned to the marina for his evening shift. Schedules were meaningless, he handled most patrols anyway. Joe, his father, arrived to pick up Owen. The two men exchanged only nods. David checked the whaler lights, radio, fuel rituals of survival before entering the lake's territory. The dock creaked gently, as if warning him not to go. The whaler drifted from the dock, its searchlight sweeping across the water's black surface. Town lights receded behind him, swallowed by a heavy darkness. Out here, George's rules didn't matter. Only the water, the wind, and the uneasy silence remained. David checked the compass, eyes never leaving the wavering edge of the waves, afraid to miss the slightest sign of something familiar and unwelcome. The first hour passed quietly, but it was the kind of quiet that sharpened instincts. David logged a drifting buoy and a large branch dangerous enough to crack a small hull. No heavy winds, no fog, only a lone seagull whose cry vanished too quickly, as if the night had swallowed it. David felt watched, even though the lake showed nothing. As he turned the boat, the spotlight brushed across the water, and David saw a faint gray column rising. At first, he mistook it for low cloud, but it didn't drift. It stood still, smoke, thick, heavy, and carrying the acrid smell of burning fuel. His heartbeat quickened. He pushed the throttle forward, steering toward it. The waves seemed to ripple differently there, as though concealing something. The smoke grew denser, stinging his eyes. Flames licked weakly, but spread fast along the stern of a sinking boat. Melted siding, charred cabin. David recognized it immediately. Frank Greeley's old trawler, a relic of the lake. now reduced to a burning carcass. But what chilled him wasn't the fire, it was the stumbling figure barely clinging to the rail. Frank coughed violently, waving weakly before collapsing to his knees. "Jump!" David shouted. Flames flared higher, roaring. Frank shook his head, choking on smoke. David threw a rope. Frank missed, nearly toppling into the fire. For an instant, David thought he saw a dark hand, something brush against the hole from below, just a flicker. Then Frank caught the rope, clinging with desperate strength. David braced his legs and hauled. Frank slammed against the whaler's side with a painful groan, but he was alive. David hooked his arms under the man and pulled him aboard. Behind them, the trawler let out a deep, metallic groan. A muffled explosion rattled the air, sending a wave of heat rolling toward them. David shoved the throttle forward, racing away before the stern collapsed into fire. Frank lay gasping, smoke still curling from his clothes. He gripped David's leg, voice shredded. Not the wiring. Something hit the hull, hard. David stared down at him. In the smoke and darkness, those words weighed more than the blast. He looked at the water flat, dark, disturbingly calm, but instinct whispered. It was below them, waiting. David's hand drifted to the pistol at his hip, a weapon he once thought unnecessary for lake patrol. But after Samantha, after Josh, after the Harpers, he wore it like a talisman. "George made me bring it," he muttered. Yet deep down, he knew bullets meant little to something that moved through the water like a shadow with bones. The burning trawler dimmed to a reddish smear on the horizon. David grabbed the radio. "George, I've got Frank. Alive but bad." A crackle, then George's steady voice. "Copy. I'll meet you at the dock." David clipped the mic back, scanning the water. Every ripple seemed too deliberate, too aware. He felt the lake breathing beneath him. The whaler eased into the marina. Its running lights carved pale beams across the pilings. George stood at the dock's edge, shoulders rigid. A few townsfolk lingered behind him, silent, staring out at the distant glow. No one asked questions, they simply waited, fear-bound, for whatever came next. Dr. Graham boarded immediately, kneeling beside Frank. Pulse weak but steady, burns manageable, lungs damaged but treatable. "A miracle," he whispered. Volunteers lifted Frank gingerly and carried him toward the waiting truck. His coughing echoed between the buildings, ragged and uneven, until the doors closed and muffled the sound. George stepped aboard. "See anything?" he asked. David shook his head. "No, but Frank swears something struck from below." George held his gaze a moment, searching for doubt, then nodded. Neither spoke further. The water tapped against the pilings like faint knuckles. Far off, the burning trawler sank from view. Later, David drove to Joe's house. Owen sat at the table, half-finished plate in front of him. Joe washed a cup at the sink, shoulders tight. When David entered, Joe only gave a curt nod. "Long night," David muttered. Joe shot him a look. "You really believe in that monster in the water nonsense?" David glanced at Owen. "I believe something's out there." Joe's face hardened. "Don't fill the boy's head with that." Silence draped the room. Owen ate faster, avoiding their eyes. When he finished, Joe sent him to gather his things. Crichton trotted after him. nails clicking on the floor. Left alone, father and son stood a few feet apart, distance feeling wider than the kitchen itself. "Let him stay tonight?" Joe said quietly. "You look like hell." David almost refused pride, lifting its head, but stopped. Owen loved it here, and he was safer. "Fine," David murmured. Owen lit up, trying to hide his excitement. Watching his son feel lighter in Joe's home cut deeper than David wanted to admit. He kissed Owen goodnight, then stepped out into a silence that felt sharper than the cold. The next morning, a metallic gray sky hung over Daggerland. Clouds sagged low, heavy with cold moisture drifting in from the lake. At the community hospital, Marcus Wilkins had not stopped talking since he'd been admitted. Nurses exchanged amused glances but let him ramble. He spoke as though silence might drag him back into the nightmare he'd survived. George and David stepped into the room. Marcus sat half upright, bandages wrapped around his chest and arms, but his eyes were sharp, sharper than either of them expected. He jabbed a finger toward them. "Don't look at me like I'm crazy. I know what I saw." His voice was rough, but each word carried force. "My granddad used to tell stories about Lake Erie," Marcus began. "Said storms weren't the only things that took people. Said sometimes, in winter, something moved under the ice fast, big, smart." George folded his arms, bracing himself. David didn't move. At least part of this story, he knew, wasn't a tale anymore. "There was one fishing crew," Marcus continued, "vanished without a trace. Boat found drifting, nets shredded. People blamed booze or bad luck, but the old folks knew better. Something rose up." He paused to cough, then leaned in. "But the story that scared my granddad most happened when he was 16, ice fishing with Henry Drake. Henry heard something moving beneath the ice, circling them, impossibly fast. Then it stopped directly under the fishing hole. When he looked down, something looked back up. Granddad said Henry turned white as snow," Marcus said softly. "His hands shook for years. Whatever was under that ice, it wasn't a fish. It was thinking." George tightened his jaw. "Old stories," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus barked a laugh. "Then explain this. Why'd something smash Frank's hull? Why'd the boat explode minutes later? Why'd Samantha vanish with no struggle?" The small room seemed to shrink around them. No one offered an answer. "My granddad said that thing knew weapons," Marcus rasped. "New bullets. People have been shooting at it for over 100 years, and it's still here. They're not." David stared at the floor, remembering bullets sinking into something that didn't flinch, like shooting water, or shooting flesh that didn't fear pain. "So, what do we do?" George asked quietly. Marcus shrugged weakly. "Every creature's got a weak point. You just have to find it." Then his voice lowered. "But don't forget it's been here long before us. It doesn't forget, and it chooses who it comes for." The two men left the hospital without speaking. The morning air bit sharply at their lungs. Even miles from the shoreline, the wind carried the smell of cold water. George shoved his hands in his pockets, mind replaying Marcus's words. "He talks too much," he murmured. "But he's not crazy." David leaned against his truck. "Most men wouldn't have gone back for the Harper kids." George nodded. "If I tell the town the truth, they'll flee by sundown." David watched him. "And if you don't say anything, we lose more people." The tension between duty and fear hung heavy in the air. "Do you think it can be killed?" George asked. David took a moment before answering. In his mind, he saw Owen small, hopeful, unaware of the thing beneath their feet. "I have to believe it can," he whispered. It was less an answer, more a vow. George returned to the station. David headed for the marina. Daggerland Point stretched ahead, a long, dim corridor of wood and fog. The dock groaned under his steps. Claire, his old sailboat, tilted slightly in greeting. But David walked past her toward the edge where the lake widened into a dull sheet of gray metal. He stared out at the horizon, blurred where sky met water. Gentle swells glided beneath the surface like slow breaths. He thought of Frank, still alive, Marcus still breathing, Owen safe in Joe's house, victories small, fragile. Yet the lake before him suggested otherwise. It felt like losing ground, even in calm moments. A sudden large ripple spread outward, too broad to be caused by wind or fish. David froze. His breath caught. He watched, waiting for something to break the surface. Nothing did. The water smoothed itself back into stillness far too quickly, as if embarrassed to reveal anything at all. David remained there longer than he intended, sensing eyes beneath the waves. The cold wind brushed his collar, but the chill inside him came from deeper, darker origins. Lake Erie was waiting, not for storms or migrating fish, but for a human mistake, and it knew it wouldn't have to wait long. After midnight, the sheriff's office was the kind of quiet that pressed on the ears. George sat beneath the green cone of his desk lamp. Piles of yellowed binders spread across the table. He told himself he was cleaning old files, but that wasn't true. Marcus's words had lodged in his mind like a splinter, demanding proof, demanding context or confirmation. He flipped through incident reports spanning decades. Shipwrecks, missing fishermen, boats returning empty. Despite the years between them, a single thread bound the stories. Lake Erie took more than it explained. Many cases blamed storms or poor navigation, but too many had no storm, no fog, just silence and absence. One report made him pause. The disappearance of Le Griffon in 1679, the first ship to ever sail the Great Lakes. Gone without debris, without bodies, without wind strong enough to break a mast. Sailors later whispered about it gliding into fog, followed by a shape in the water too large, too smooth to be a wave. Another binder detailed the 1,909 loss of Marquette and Bessemer, no 2, more than 30 men aboard. Weather mild, no distress call, only a single lifeboat found days later, battered from beneath, wood splintered like something had punched upward from the deep. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Not waves, not wind, something else." He turned to the 1,913 Black Friday storm reports. While dozens of ships were lost, 2 vessels on Lake Erie vanished without evidence of capsizing. In one folder, a rescuer's note chilled him. Nets slashed clean, not torn. Never seen the lake do that. The handwriting dipped as if the writer's hand trembled. George leaned back, rubbing his temples. Storms, fog, human error. Convenient explanations for families. But the lake's history told a different story, one passed down in murmurs, not newspapers. Something had lived in those waters longer than Daggerland had been a town, longer than Ohio had been a state, and it had patterns. He shut the binder and walked to the window. Moonlight lay thin across the rooftops. The lake shimmered beyond them, pale and watching. He wondered how many times the town had already fought this thing without realizing it. How many warnings had been dismissed as superstition or drunken tales. How many families had been swallowed whole before their stories were even written down. George extinguished the lamp. Darkness filled the room instantly, thick and viscous. He stood still until his eyes adjusted. Even then, the shadows felt alive, like the lake had seeped into the walls. For the first time, he felt outmatched, not as sheriff, not as a man with a badge, but as a human, standing before something ancient. He locked the binders away and stepped outside. The street was empty, lights dim, the whole town seeming to shrink from the shoreline. He drove slowly, scanning the houses, curtains drawn, doors bolted. Not fear of crime, fear of something else, something that lived where streetlights couldn't reach. Meanwhile, at the marina, David hadn't slept. He stood at the end of the dock, facing the vast gray sheet of water. Whaler and Claire rocked gently at their ropes, oblivious to the tension growing in the man beside them. The lake looked harmless, too harmless, like a predator pretending to sleep. He let the cold air settle into his lungs, listening to the quiet slap of waves against wood. Nights like this were the worst, too calm, too even, too knowing. Danger didn't always make noise. Sometimes it waited behind stillness, letting men convince themselves nothing hunted them. David closed his eyes and remembered Owen running across the yard that afternoon, glove too big, steps too light. He pictured that innocence near the water's edge, too close to the place that took Samantha, too close to the thing that had looked at him once and smiled. He opened his eyes. A ripple crossed the surface, wide and deliberate. Not wind, not fish, something heavy, something purposeful. The dock creaked beneath him. For a moment, David was certain something enormous passed just under the planks, brushing them as it moved. He stepped back. His pulse climbed. The ripple faded, smoothed over like a wound trying to hide. But David was no stranger to deception. The lake was quiet again, but not empty. He sensed its attention, sharp and cold, fixed on him like a predator, studying the man foolish enough to return night after night. He turned to leave, but glanced back once more. The lake lay flat as polished stone, reflecting nothing. That stillness terrified him more than waves ever could, because still water hid everything. And somewhere below, the thing that had haunted Daggerland for centuries was wide awake. Later that night, George sat alone in his cruiser on Lake Road. The fog had thickened into low, ghostly veils drifting across the pavement. He rolled down the window. A wet chill moved in, thin, sharp, and carrying a faint odor of brine. It reminded him of the nights Samantha went missing, of the silence afterward. Silence had a shape now, a weight. He turned onto the road, leading toward the Harper crash site. The asphalt there always felt colder. The trees bent strangely too, as if leaning away from the lake. George parked, stepped out, and let the fog swallow his boots. The spot where the Harper SUV had died still carried an unnatural stillness, like sound refused to settle there. He walked slowly, flashlights sweeping the ditches. He had searched this place a dozen times, but tonight it felt different, like he wasn't alone. The beam caught nothing but tall grass and dew, yet George felt watched, not by eyes in the trees, by something deeper. A cold pulse beneath the soil, like the heartbeat of water buried under land. He froze. A soft, dragging noise whispered through the fog, too far to be footsteps, too heavy to be an animal. George angled the flashlight, but the fog swallowed the beam whole. The sound stopped. Then the silence thickened, pressing against his ears. He stepped back, unable to explain the sudden, overwhelming sense that he should not be here. When he returned to the cruiser, he didn't start it immediately. His breath fogged the glass. He watched the road where the sound had come from. Nothing moved, but he felt certain something had followed him, or more terrifying, had let him leave. He drove off slowly, headlights cutting a narrow path through the emptiness. At the same time, miles away, David had taken the whaler back onto the lake. Couldn't sleep, couldn't sit still. The spotlight swept across the black water, catching nothing but ripples of silver. He gripped the wheel tightly, scanning every direction. He wasn't patrolling anymore. He was searching to confirm a fear he no longer denied. The lake exhaled a long breath of cold mist as the whaler cut forward. David slowed near the center, letting the boat drift. The night felt hollow. No gulls, no wind, not even insects, as if every living thing had abandoned the lake, leaving only him and whatever lurked beneath. Something thudded softly against the hull. Not a wave, not debris, a tap, almost a knock. David's entire body went still. He leaned over the rail, scanning the water. A circle of ripples widened in the dark. Then another, too precise, too rhythmic, like fingers drumming lightly under the surface. He reached for the spotlight, sweeping it hard to starboard. The beam struck only black waves, but for a moment, a fraction of a heartbeat, he saw a silhouette beneath the water. Large, long-limbed, moving with unnatural grace. By the time he snapped the spotlight back, the shadow was gone, leaving the surface too calm, too clean. David stumbled backward, chest tight. He clutched the rail, breath shaking. It wasn't fear of drowning or darkness. It was the certainty that the thing below him had surfaced briefly just to let him see it. Not enough to identify. Just enough to haunt. Enough to tell him that last night's attack wasn't an accident. He forced himself to breathe slowly and start the engine. But as he turned the boat back toward shore, the water behind him pulsed outward. One enormous ripple, then stillness, as if something massive had risen just beneath the surface, pushing the lake outward without breaking it. David didn't look back again. George's cruiser arrived at the marina just minutes before David returned. He stood on the dock, arms crossed, face drained of color. David stepped off the whaler, eyes locked on the lake behind him. No words were necessary. George saw it immediately in David's posture, the stiffness, the tremor in his jaw. "You saw it again," George said quietly. David didn't answer. George glanced at the water and lowered his voice further. "Then we can't waste time." David swallowed hard. Marcus might be right. It's choosing, and it's getting bold. George exhaled slowly. "Then we need to get ahead of it." The two men stood at the edge of the dock, facing the vast darkness that stretched before them. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to debate. The lake lay motionless, feigning innocence under the thin morning moon, but both men felt the truth. It was waiting, watching, and something old had awakened fully. At last, George said, "Meet me tomorrow, early. We're going through every map, every depth chart, every forgotten story this town has." David nodded. The wind rose, carrying a low moan across the surface. Neither man reacted, though it slithered down their spines. They simply turned away, each wondering how long Daggerland had left. George spent the early hours of dawn combing through more maps and historical logs. Depth charts, migration routes, old fishing records passed down through families. He marked locations where disappearances clustered, drawing a pattern that chilled him. The points did not scatter, they spiraled, tightening around one place offshore as if circling a den. He pinned the chart to the wall, stepping back. The markings resembled a slow whirlpool of tragedies stretching across a century. Storms came and went. Fishermen lived and died, but the disappearances always returned to that center point, a place locals avoided instinctively without knowing why. A place older than charts, older than names. Meanwhile, at Joe's house, Owen ate breakfast quietly while Joe flipped through the morning paper. The boy seemed cheerful enough, but every so often he glanced toward the window that faced the lake, though it was miles away. "Dad works there," he murmured. Joe's jaw tightened. "Your father knows what he's doing." But even he didn't sound convinced. David arrived soon after, exhausted but determined. Joe studied him a moment, as if deciding whether to speak. He didn't. Instead, he stepped aside and let David inside. Owen ran to him, hugging his side. David held the boy longer than usual before sending him off to pack his things for school. Joe watched the hesitation in David's eyes. "Whatever you're planning," Joe said quietly, "don't put him in danger." David didn't answer. He couldn't promise anything because even staying inland didn't feel safe anymore. The lake wasn't creeping toward town. Something in it was simply reaching farther. David finally said, "I'll keep him away from the water. That's all I can do." Later, David and George met in the sheriff's office. They stood before the wall of maps and notes, tracing the spiral of disappearances. "It's hunting ground," David said. George nodded slowly. "Or territory." David tapped the center point. "Whatever it is, this is where it lives." The lake outside seemed to pulse in agreement. They spent hours forming a plan, what equipment they could gather, how to approach the point without alerting the creature, where to set traps if traps were even possible. But everything felt small compared to the thing they were preparing for. Human logic against something that didn't follow human rules. By noon, both men were drained. George stared at the board. "If we go out there, there's a chance neither of us comes back." David didn't blink. "There's a bigger chance someone else dies if we don't." Silence stretched between them. Neither was trying to be heroic. They were simply cornered by reality. George finally said, "We move at dawn tomorrow, before the lake wakes up." David nodded, but inside, he felt something else, fear, that the creature was already awake, following their steps, listening, learning. He couldn't shake the sense that every plan they made was being measured from below. That evening, George drove Laura home from her mother's. She watched him from the passenger seat, sensing the weight he carried. "You're not telling me everything," she said softly. George tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I can't. Not yet." Laura looked out the window, troubled but silent. Secrets had become part of surviving in Daggerland. At home, as she unpacked groceries, George stood by the back door, staring at the tree line. He imagined the lake beyond the trees, vast and ancient. He imagined something rising from it, slow, patient, smiling that impossible grin. He shut the door and locked it twice without thinking. Night fell with an unnatural heaviness. The wind felt wrong, too warm, then suddenly too cold. Owen slept at home again, David lying awake nearby. Every creak of the house made him sit up. He checked the locks 3 times. Crichton paced the hallway, whining softly, hackles raised at nothing. Near midnight, David stepped onto the porch for air. The sky was moonless, clouds drifting low. Far off, he heard something, a distant, rhythmic splash, too slow and heavy to be a boat. It paused, then resumed, as if something enormous was testing the shoreline, searching along its edge. David backed inside, bolting the door. He checked on Owen, who slept undisturbed, but David couldn't sleep again. He sat by the window, gun on the table, eyes fixed on the road leading toward the lake. He felt the creature's attention stretching this far, like a hand reaching through water and soil. The next dawn, before the sun broke the horizon, George and David met at the marina. The lake lay flat and silver, expressionless, but both men sensed the truth. It was waiting for them. They boarded the whaler without speaking. The engine rumbled to life. As they pushed off into the gray morning, neither man looked back. Whatever lived in the deep had ruled Daggerland long enough. Thank you for listening to Darkwatch Stories. If this story gave you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so we can keep bringing you more. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware of what might be watching in the dark.